Somewhere in the forest of northern Cambodia, there is a wall. And on that wall, a king had a list carved into stone. Not a poem, not a prayer, an inventory. It records what one temple complex required to function. Thousands of villages assigned to its upkeep, tens of thousands of people bound to its service. Quantities of rice measured out by the year, cloth, honey, wax, sesame, sets of vessels, precious stones counted individually, mosquito nets listed with the same seriousness as the gold. It is one of the most extraordinary economic documents of the medieval world, and it was not written for economists. It was written for a god, because the whole point was that the god should know exactly what he had been given. Now here's the thing that should stop you. In all of that accounting, across an empire that at its height controlled a large part of mainland Southeast Asia, that built the biggest religious monument on the planet, that fed a population living in a settlement complex the size of a modern metropolitan area, there was almost no money, no coins in circulation as a state currency, no treasury minting silver with the king's face on it, no mint at all in the way you would expect from an empire of that scale. The Khmer Empire built Angkor Wat, and it did it without cash. So how do you run a state without money? How do you pay an army, feed a priesthood, move a mountain of sandstone 40 kilometers, and keep hundreds of thousands of people organized if nobody in the system is being paid a wage in anything you could put in a purse? The answer is one of the strangest and most sophisticated economic arrangements ever built by human beings. And the answer also explains why it ended. Because this is not a story about a civilization that was conquered. Conquest came late, and it came to something already hollow. This is a story about an economy that solved one problem so completely, so beautifully, that it could not survive the problem changing. Let us go and look at the machine. Start with the water, because everything starts with the water. Cambodia has 2 seasons, and they are extreme opposites. For roughly half the year, the monsoon dumps enormous quantities of rain on the landscape. For the other half, it delivers almost nothing. The Tonle Sap, the Great Lake at the center of the country, does something almost unique on Earth. When the Mekong swells, the river feeding the lake reverses direction, and the lake expands to several times its dry season size, then drains back again. An inland sea that inhales and exhales once a year. That rhythm is generous, and it is dangerous. Too much water at once, then none at all. A farmer with rice in the ground faces flooding, then drought in the same 12 months. The society that grew up there built its entire civilization around solving that timing problem, not creating water, managing when it arrives. And the scale of what they built is difficult to convey. Angkor was not a city in the walled, dense European sense. Modern aerial laser survey, flown over the region in the last couple of decades, has stripped away the forest canopy digitally and revealed what is underneath. And the results reorganize the field. What is under there is a vast, low-density urban landscape. Not a compact city with fields outside it, but a sprawling mesh, hundreds of square kilometers, of house mounds, ponds, garden plots, small local shrines, embankment roads, and channels, stitched together in a grid oriented to the cardinal directions, spreading out from the great temples and merging into the rice land at the edges without any hard boundary. Estimates of the population vary widely, and any specific number should be treated with caution, but the serious range puts it among the largest settlement complexes in the pre-industrial world, something on the order of several 100,000 people living in that landscape. And running through all of it, the water infrastructure. Canals, embankments, diversions of entire rivers, and the barays, which are the signature. A baray is a reservoir, but that description understates it badly. These are not dug pits. They are rectangular bodies of water held in place by massive, raised earthen embankments built up above the surrounding ground. The largest of them, the West Baray, is around 8 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide, and it still holds water today, roughly 1,000 years after it was made. Sit with the labor implication. There were no machines. That embankment is soil moved by human beings with baskets. millions upon millions of basket loads. And it is not the only one, it is simply the biggest. Now, a long argument in the field, and I want to give you both sides honestly, because the popular version of this story usually gives you one. For much of the 20th century, the dominant interpretation, associated especially with the French scholar Bernard-Philippe Groslierre, was what gets called the hydraulic city. In this reading, the barays and canals were the engine of the whole economy. They irrigated the rice fields, they allowed multiple harvests a year, that agricultural surplus fed the enormous population, and controlling that water system was the source of royal power. The king was, functionally, the man who owned the tap. Then came the pushback. Other scholars pointed out inconvenient details. The barays sit at elevations that make large-scale gravity irrigation of the surrounding fields awkward. There is limited direct inscriptional evidence describing them as irrigation works. Their symbolic and religious meaning is unmistakable, since a temple mountain surrounded by water is a model of the cosmos, the sacred peak in the cosmic ocean, and these things sit exactly in that arrangement. So perhaps they were primarily ritual and prestige and water storage for the temples in the city, and rather less about crops. Where the balance of opinion has settled, roughly, is somewhere in between and more interesting than either extreme. The laser survey work showed a genuinely enormous, genuinely engineered network of channels and embankments extending far beyond the monumental core, with clear evidence of water being captured, redirected, and distributed across the landscape at scale. This was a managed hydrological system. It was also religious. The two were not separate categories in that culture, and it is our habit, not theirs, to insist that a thing must be either sacred or practical. But there is a further point, and it is the one that matters for how the story ends. A system that big is not just an asset, it is a commitment. Every channel, every embankment, every sluice is something that must be maintained, forever, by organized labor, or it silts, breaches, and turns from an asset into a hazard. They did not merely build infrastructure. They took out a mortgage on it, payable in labor, every year, without end. Now, the rice. Rice is the currency of this civilization in the sense that matters. It is the store of value, the wage, the tax, the offering, and the measure. When the inscriptions record wealth, they are frequently recording quantities of rice, and land that produces rice, and people who work that land. And rice has a property that shapes everything. It is enormously productive per unit of land compared to most staples, but it is extremely demanding of labor. Transplanting, weeding, managing water levels field by field, harvesting, threshing. It rewards dense population and constant coordinated work. So the binding constraint on this economy is not land. There was land. The constraint is people, and the organization of people. Which brings us to the strangest institution in the whole system, and the true center of Khmer economics, the temple. Forget for a moment everything a temple means to you. In the Khmer world, a major temple foundation was a legal and economic entity. It was closer to a chartered corporation or an endowed institution than to a church. Here is how it worked. A king, or a high official, or a wealthy family would establish a foundation. They would endow it with land, and crucially, with the labor attached to that land, and with rights to specific revenues in kind. The foundation existed in perpetuity to maintain the deity, or the image of an ancestor installed as a deity, with daily offerings, ceremonies, music, cleaning, repair. And the inscription on the wall was the deed. It named the donor, it named the property, it listed the obligations, it recorded the villages assigned, it counted the servants, and it typically ended with an elaborate curse on anyone who interfered with the arrangement. Do you see what that is? It is a legal record of property rights and permanent income streams, published in stone, in a public place, guaranteed by religion rather than by a court. Now compound it. Because these foundations accumulated, a new king does not usually dismantle the endowments of his predecessors, That would be sacrilege and politically dangerous. He founds his own. And the greatest kings founded enormous ones, dedicated to their parents, to themselves, to their teachers. The great complex built by Jayavarman VII in honor of his mother is the one with the inventory I opened with. The numbers carved there are staggering, and even if you treat any single medieval figure with appropriate skepticism about exaggeration and about what exactly is being counted, the order of magnitude is the point. Thousands of settlements, tens of thousands of people, an institution consuming the produce of a substantial slice of the countryside permanently to keep one temple functioning. And that same king built several such foundations, and built hospitals along the roads, and rest houses, and roads, and a new walled capital, and the temple with the enormous faces, all in a few decades. Now put your economist hat on and look at the balance sheet. Every foundation is a permanent claim on land and labor, removed from the general pool, dedicated to a non-productive purpose, and legally and religiously very hard to reverse. That is an economy accumulating fixed obligations, generation after generation, with no mechanism for writing them off. It works magnificently while you are expanding. Every new conquest, every new area brought under cultivation, every increase in population gives you fresh capacity to endow the next foundation. The system is designed to grow, and it is very good at growing. Ask what happens when it stops growing. Hold that question. Now the labor, and this is the part that the tourist brochures do not cover. The inscriptions name enormous numbers of people bound to temple service. The Khmer term, usually translated as slaves, khnum, covers a range of unfree and semi-free statuses that do not map neatly onto any single modern category, and specialists are careful about this. Some were assigned to specific duties: dancers, musicians, weavers, rice pounders, guardians of the sanctuary. Some were tied to land. Their status was in many cases inherited. They could be given, transferred, and listed as assets, and they were, by name, in the hundreds, on temple walls. And alongside that, the general population owed labor service, corvée, obligated work on the king's projects, on the roads, on the reservoirs, on the temples, on hauling stone. That is how you pay for a monument without money. You do not hire workers, because there is no wage economy to hire them into. You have a claim on their time, backed by law, hierarchy, and religion, and you exercise it. The cost of Angkor Wat in the accounts of the Khmer state is not a number, it is a schedule of obligations. And the sandstone. The blocks came from quarries at a mountain a good distance away, and recent work tracing canal routes has strongly suggested they were floated along a network of waterways, which tells you the water system was also a freight system. The channels are irrigation and cosmology, and a logistics network at the same time. So the economy has three legs: water infrastructure that makes the rice reliable, rice that feeds concentrated population whose labor is owed, upward, through a hierarchy of local lords to the king and the temple foundations, and which is spent on building more infrastructure and more foundations. Now, where does trade fit? The Khmer heartland is inland. That matters enormously. The trade of Southeast Asia in this period, the trade that made the maritime states rich, ran by sea. It ran through the straits, along the coasts, connecting China to India and beyond. Angkor sat away from that. It was an agrarian power in a region increasingly organized around maritime commerce, and it traded, certainly, in forest products, in aromatic woods, in resins, in ivory and rhinoceros horn and rare feathers, in exchange for Chinese ceramics and silks. Chinese ceramics turn up in the archaeology in quantity. But the state did not derive its power from taxing trade the way a port polity does. It derived power from controlling land, water, and people, which is exactly why it never developed coinage in the way its neighbors eventually did. If your economy is a system of obligations in kind, with local exchange handled by barter and by weighing out cloth and metal, you do not need a mint. Coins solve the problem of impersonal exchange between strangers at scale. The Khmer system was built for personal exchange between people whose relative rank was already known. That is not primitiveness, it is a different solution. But it is a solution with a particular blindness, and the blindness will matter. And now we have a witness. One, and only really one, and he is priceless. In 1296, a Chinese envoy named Zhou Daguan traveled to Angkor and stayed for about a year, and afterwards he wrote it down. What survives is not complete, but it is the only substantial eyewitness description of the city while it was still functioning that we possess. He describes the walls and the gates and the towers. He describes the royal processions with an outsider's slightly overwhelmed eye. He notices, being Chinese and therefore from a world of copper cash, that the Khmer conduct everyday transactions using rice, grain, cloth, and Chinese goods rather than coin, and that they use small weights of gold and silver for larger dealings. He describes markets run by women. He notes that trade at the local level is very largely in women's hands, and that Chinese men who came to trade found it advantageous to take a local wife because she would actually know how to do business there. He remarks on the houses, the tiled roofs reserved for the elite and thatch for everyone else, on bathing habits, on festivals, on the sheer number of slaves in wealthy households as a marker of status, and on the legal system, which he found harsh. And he notes something in passing that reads very differently with hindsight. He mentions wars with the Siamese, and that the countryside had been damaged and depopulated in places by fighting. He is writing near the end. The great building age is already over. The last of the enormous foundations went up about a century before he arrived. Nobody in the city, presumably, thought of themselves as living in a late period. They rarely do. So what went wrong? The old story was simple and satisfying, and mostly wrong. In this version, the Siamese army from Ayutthaya sacked Angkor, traditionally dated to 1431. The city fell, the jungle grew over it, the end. The sack happened, or something like it happened, but by then Angkor had already been declining for well over a century, and the sack looks less like a cause and more like a late symptom. Cities that are functioning tend to be rebuilt after they are sacked. Angkor was largely not rebuilt, and that is the fact that needs explaining. Here is what the evidence now suggests, and it is a convergence of several pressures rather than a single blow. Start with the climate, because this is the finding that changed the conversation. Researchers have reconstructed the monsoon record for the region using tree rings from long-lived cypress in the highlands of Vietnam, which preserve a year-by-year record going back centuries. What that record shows is that the 14th and 15th centuries included periods of severe, prolonged drought in mainland Southeast Asia, and that those droughts were punctuated by intervals of unusually intense rainfall. Now think about what that pattern does to the Angkorian water system specifically. Drought starves it. Channels run low, reservoirs drop. The reliability that justified the whole apparatus disappears. Harvests fail. But the violent wet years may be worse. A network built up over centuries, with embankments and sluices and diversions layered on top of one another, is calibrated to a certain range of flow. Push a great deal more water through it than it was designed for, and it does not simply overflow, it breaks. And the archaeological evidence in the canal system does show damage, breaching, and heavy sediment deposition consistent with severe flood events, alongside signs of hasty patch repairs, structures rebuilt in cruder fashion using stone robbed from elsewhere. That last detail is the human story in miniature. The repairs got worse. Somebody was still trying, with fewer hands and less authority, and the standard was falling. And this is where the economic structure becomes fatal. Because now you can see why the mortgage was the problem. The whole system depended on being able to mobilize vast quantities of obligated labor for maintenance. That mobilization depended on the authority of the center. The authority of the center depended, in large part, on the system delivering, on the water arriving, the harvests coming in, the king's cosmic role being visibly validated by prosperity. Break that loop anywhere, and it unwinds in both directions. Bad harvests weaken the center. A weakened center cannot compel maintenance. Without maintenance, the infrastructure degrades. Degraded infrastructure means worse harvests. The loop that built the empire runs in reverse, and it runs just as efficiently backwards as it did forwards. Meanwhile, the fixed obligations remained. All those foundations, all those endowments, all those thousands of villages assigned in perpetuity to feed temples, carved in stone and protected by curses, still claiming their share of a shrinking output. An economy with enormous accumulated liabilities, no way to restructure them, and a falling revenue base. Add the second pressure, which is that the world outside had shifted. Maritime trade with China was growing significantly in this period, and the polities positioned to catch it were coastal and rivermouth states, not inland agrarian ones. The value in the region was moving toward ports. And Cambodia had an alternative. Down south, near where the great rivers meet, near where Phnom Penh stands today, you have access to the Mekong and the sea beyond it. The Khmer court eventually shifted its center southward, and later, Cambodian capitals grew up in that direction, oriented toward river and maritime commerce. That is not simply flight, that is a rational relocation toward where the money now was, by a court that could read a balance sheet even if it did not use coins. Add a third pressure, and it is subtler and quite profound. Religion changed. The great Angkorian state was built on a Hindu and Mahayana Buddhist royal ideology, in which the king was bound up with the divine, and in which the correct and necessary act of piety was the construction of enormous stone monuments and the endowment of great foundations. Theravada Buddhism spread widely through the region in these centuries and became dominant in Cambodia. It is a tradition centered on the monastic community, on merit earned through supporting monks, on more modest and more local religious buildings, often in wood. Consider the economic implication. The single greatest sink of surplus in the old system, monumental construction as a royal religious obligation, loses its justification. If merit no longer requires a sandstone mountain, nobody is going to build a sandstone mountain. The enormous flow of labor and produce into monumental projects simply stops being the thing a pious ruler does. That is not a decline in devotion. It is a redirection of the entire investment strategy of a civilization. And then, into a landscape of failing infrastructure, contested authority, a court looking south, and an ideology that no longer demanded the old expenditure, comes the Siamese army. And the city is not rebuilt, because by then there is no longer a system whose logic requires it to be there. Angkor was never entirely abandoned, incidentally. That image of a city swallowed whole and forgotten is a 19th century European romance. Angkor Wat itself remained an active place of worship, maintained by monks, visited by pilgrims, known to Cambodians continuously. There are inscriptions from later centuries. There were Japanese visitors in the 17th century who left graffiti and drew a plan. The forest took much of the wider landscape, because the wider landscape had been made of wood and earth and rice, and those things do not survive without people. The stone stayed, and people stayed with the stone. So what is the lesson in the ledger? I think there are three, and they are uncomfortable in a familiar way. The first is about infrastructure as a liability. We are trained to think of built infrastructure as pure asset, as accumulated wealth. It is not. It is a machine that requires continuous input to remain valuable, and the more elaborate it is, the more input it demands, and the more catastrophically it fails when the input stops. The Khmer built a water system so extensive that maintaining it required the empire, which meant the empire could never afford to become weak, ever, for even a generation. There was no low power mode. That is a system with no slack in it. And systems with no slack are extraordinarily good, right up until the moment they are not. The second is about obligations that cannot be renegotiated. The genius of the temple foundation was permanence. Endow it in stone, curse anyone who touches it, and the arrangement outlives kings and dynasties and doubts. That is what made it trustworthy, and that is what made it accumulate. But an economy needs some mechanism for canceling old claims, for admitting that a commitment made in a rich century cannot be honored in a poor one. Sacred obligations do not have that mechanism. They just keep claiming their rice from a smaller and smaller harvest until something breaks that is not the obligation. And the third is about specialization. The Khmer solved their environment with exceptional brilliance. They built the greatest inland agrarian machine in the region, perfectly tuned to a particular climate and a particular set of political relationships. And when the climate wobbled and the region's wealth migrated to the sea, all that brilliance was oriented in the wrong direction. Their neighbors who had less impressive achievements were more able to move, because they had less invested in staying. There is a version of this civilization that is only about beauty, and the beauty is genuine. Walk toward Angkor Wat at dawn, and the thing does what it was designed to do to a human nervous system 900 years after the last person who designed it died. But do not look at those towers and see only devotion. Look at them and see the labor. See the obligated days of work of hundreds of thousands of people who did not choose it, hauling stone that floated in on canals that also fed their fields. See the accounting on the walls, the villages counted, the servants named, the rice measured out by the year, the whole balance sheet of a state carved where the god could read it. That building is not a mystery, it is a receipt, and the empire that issued it did not fall to an invader. It ran out of the one thing it had never learned to store, which was not water, and was not rice, and was not gold. It was the ability to change what it was for.